I'm Dr. Caren Sax. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Administration, Rehabilitation, and Post-Secondary Education at San Diego State University. I've been here for almost 30 years now, but I started my career as a special education teacher. And the first year that I taught was the first year that my students were ever allowed into public school because of the severity of their disabilities. A law was passed in 1975 that allowed students with very significant disabilities for everybody to be able to come to public school. And that was the first year that I started teaching. And we were in a small building with about 40 students and a bunch of us new teachers trying to figure out what to do with all these kids from ages 5 to 22 who first stepped foot into public school. So when I was teaching, this was far before the ADA was passed, I learned a lot about the lack of accessibility. In fact, when the students I was teaching, I started teaching the older students, the teenagers, and we didn't have a whole lot of time with them in school because they had just started. And I realized that they needed to learn how to access their community. They needed to learn how to get jobs. They needed to learn all those life skills because we had so short a time with them. And in my school district, they had people whose job it was to look for jobs for students. So they're job developers of sorts. And when I asked for a job developer for our school, I was told that we wouldn't be getting one because our students couldn't work. And as you can imagine, that just motivated me to figure it out because I knew my students could work. And so I started going out and meeting some of the business people in the neighborhood, and they introduced me to other business people. I started learning how to talk to employers, which was not something I learned as in my special education program, as learning to be a teacher. And I found that my students, of course, could work. And I appealed directly to employers, and they helped me learn the ropes of how to do all of this. And I started teaching my students how to ride the bus and how to figure out some kinds of accommodations for them to do jobs. And it was so exciting when a student got a job and found something that they liked to do and that they were good at. And we had parents who never in a million years had thought their sons and daughters could work, and yet they saw them be successful, and parents who were very nervous about having them even go in the community were so excited, and they became, of course, our biggest advocates for expanding this vocational program. And so I found that no matter where I went, I was trying to raise awareness and, more importantly, raise expectations about the students I was working for and working with. When I came to San Diego State, it was to really look at how we could use assistive technology to connect people with disabilities, whether they were going to school, getting jobs, accessing their community in any way. So assistive technology really became an area that I was focused on. And we had a couple of federal grants that funded me and other colleagues to develop some community partnerships to support the development of assistive technology. So this was in the earlier days. Again, the ADA had just passed, the communities were opening up, employers were becoming more aware, and we started getting people from the community really interested in helping us to make modifications, to help individuals access the world that they wanted to access. And so I started teaching a course around the applications of assistive technology. I co-taught it with an engineering faculty member, and we had students from special education, from rehabilitation, from engineering, and we also had people from the community. We had occupational and physical therapists, speech therapists, we had people who sold equipment, we had different kinds of engineers who took the class. And we all sort of learned together what the possibilities were when you made a good match with people with disabilities and an assistive technology that could connect them to the activities that they wanted to do. And we found out it made such a huge difference, and it gave people control over their lives. One of the activities that we did in the class was to do the ADA accessibility survey. And this was so eye-opening for me and for my students and for people who were in our community who were working with us. And so we would have students go out and conduct the survey and find out how accessible or not their local neighborhoods were. They went to retail places, they went to restaurants and hotels and any kind of places that they might want to access in their neighborhoods. And what we found is for all of us, you would just never look at a place the same way. And having that ADA accessibility survey as a context and as a guide to help us look at where we could help make changes, because part of the assignment was not only taking the survey and finding out what was good and where people could make improvements, but also to do the advocacy, to bring that awareness and to make sure that people realized that they had a whole market out there that they hadn't thought about. And in order for that market to access their business, they needed to make it more accessible. So it was a really exciting, and to this day, I still teach the class and I still do the ADA accessibility survey. And luckily, things have gotten better and we've seen a lot of improvements, but we always find things that can be improved. So I have seen many positive changes, both in physical access to buildings, but also access through electronic and digital communication. And that's been a big one that has made a huge difference. I think that what happens often is we don't think about these considerations up front, that all too often it's after the fact. Even at the university, whenever they're introducing new software, new technologies, new platforms that we're using, I always ask up front, what about the accessibility? And it used to be that the answer was always inevitably, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. I've seen that change, and people are really looking at the accessibility issues up front. But I think that really needs to happen more. And the idea of universal design has to be thought of up front, and it's much more inclusive. It's also more cost effective. And so I think getting that into the mindset of people up front, and I've had a chance to work with architecture students, for example, and being able to introduce them to individuals with disabilities has given them insight that it's not about compliance. It's not just about compliance and going with the codes. But once they met people who were accessing the community in different ways, it helped them think about design in a new way. And it encouraged them to consider their creativity in how to make their designs, whether it was buildings or outside landscapes, whatever it was, that they should make those more accessible for a wider range of people. What I'd like to see is disability firmly planted in the diversity discussions. I think all too often, the diversity discussions, particularly that are happening now, often leave disability out of the equation. And disability crosses over, intersects with every other identity, whether it's gender, age, ethnicity, every aspect. You'll find people with disabilities. And in fact, any of us can join the disabled group at any time. And most of us will at some point in our lives. And so I think being able to think proactively and holistically about disability is really critical. And it has to be firmly planted in those conversations that we're having about diversity.